Good morning or almost good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our part of our webinar, Return to Work, COVID-19 Employment Policies and Business Best Practices, sponsored today by the Salt Lake Chamber's Roadmap to Recovery Coalition. For those who don't know, I'm Josh Brown, Director of Government Affairs for Rio Tinto Kennecott, and a member of the Roadmap to Recovery Coalition. For those of you who don't know and are joining maybe for the first time today, the Roadmap to Recovery Coalition is a business-led coalition focused on implementing and promoting our economic recovery. And a lot has changed, as we're all aware, in the past year. Businesses have had to pivot from what we knew and what we're comfortable with to completely the unknown. As Utah's economy is bouncing back, vaccination numbers are increasing, and positive COVID cases are steadily continuing to decrease. Many businesses are wondering what is returning to normalcy and what does that mean as we adjust going back to work. So during part one today, you're going to hear from SixFifty. They're going to provide an overview and recommended employment policies when returning to work. In part two, which is tomorrow, we will hear from various industries, discuss best practices, tips, and how we return successfully to work. So we have Ryan Parker. He's the Chief Legal Product Officer of SixFifty. Mary Kulbuth, General Counsel and VP of Legal Product, SixFifty. And we have Trent Hymas, who is not on camera, who is the Digital Marketing. Should be an informative session. If you have any questions during that, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can. And with that, we'll hear from our guests.
Thank you, Josh. We're excited to be here. For those of you that don't know much about SixFifty, we're a Utah-based legal technology company. We're the subsidiary of the law firm Wilson Sonsini, which is a large Palo Alto-based law firm that is well known across the country for its work with technology companies and startups. And so what we do is we use the expertise from the firm, we combine that with technology to create solutions that can help make the law more accessible for businesses and for individuals. And the reason they've invited us to present today is that last March, as many of you will remember, in fact, the turning point for us as far as the pandemic was concerned was when Rudy Gobert, our own star basketball player, and this I guess would be not last March, but the March before, contracted COVID and the NBA shut down. And like many of you, we as a business thought, oh, what do we do now? We sent our employees home. We contacted Wilson Sonsini, the attorneys that we work with, and we talked to them about what we needed to do to move from being an office-centric workplace to a remote workplace. And they helped us to create some different policies and some worksheets that we could use to help us with that process. And as we were working with them, we realized that there was a huge need for businesses to be able to know, how to return to the work site, what they needed to do to protect their employees, and what steps they needed to take to comply with federal, state, and local laws. And so we developed a return to work tool set that we launched later in the summer. And we are now helping over 200 businesses, including many in Utah, return to the work site and put the policy foundation that they need in place to move forward as restrictions ease and as vaccination numbers increase. And so the chamber invited us to come and talk a little about some of the things that we have learned in helping these businesses. And we're going to do that in a couple of different ways. But before we launch into the agenda, let me just say, Marie and I love to have this feel more like a conversation. We want to answer your questions. If you have thoughts or things you want to share, please put them in the Q&A button so that we can make sure to track them and answer those. And we'll try to answer those as we go along. We also have a Q&A sort of set aside at the end. So please don't be shy in putting your questions in there. We're happy to try do our best to answer them. And we hope that this is an interesting and lively discussion. In addition, if you're interested in learning more about SixFifty, you can visit our website, sixfifty.com, and look at any of our solutions. And we'll put in the chat a link if you want to go and check out kind of what we do, the way that we help businesses, both with the return to work and with employee handbooks and policies. So let me dive into the agenda here. We're almost done with the introduction, and we're going to start with the policies and procedures that businesses need to think about when returning to the workplace. And we're going to hit some of the big ones. We're going to start with vaccinations, which are really on the forefront of almost everyone's minds as they think about how to implement the CDC's new guidance. We're going to talk about masks and physical distancing. Then we'll move on to health screeners and cleaning and sanitation. And we'll talk about what businesses should be thinking about as they're either returning to the workplace or transitioning to having more employees in the workplace. At the intermission, we'll give you the CLE code. For those of you that are attorneys and are hoping to get CLE credit, we'll give you a code that you can write down that'll help you with that process. And then we're going to transition into looking at what businesses need moving forward. We're not going to return exactly to where we were before the pandemic. We're entering what some are calling a new normal. And there are a lot of policies that businesses should be thinking about and issues that they should be thinking about as we move into what for many businesses will be sort of a hybrid workplace that will include both employees in an office and employees who are working at home. And when we go there, we'll talk about technology systems and video conferencing policies, telecommuting policies, relocation policies, outside employment work schedules, and hoteling, an issue that has become really a hot topic in the business industry. So without spending any more time on the introduction, why don't we jump right into Utah's employment landscape? And I'll turn the time over to Marie.
Thanks, Ryan and Josh, both of you. One of the things that Josh mentioned was that, things are really changing. And, for Utah, there's a really nice, solid employment landscape, especially in comparison to the rest of the country right now. So we've definitely had our struggles, but generally speaking, the state is doing very well. We just had a new employment report that came out in April, showing, a 2.8% unemployment rate for the state and two-year job growth at 2.3%. To give you some, just some comparison, right now, the US unemployment rate is 6.1%, and the two-year job growth rate is -4%. So really quite a difference there. So in terms of the strength of employment right now, we're really doing well. But we have also seen a lot of change. So our biggest gains in employment in the last year have been in professional business services, construction, and trade. But we've seen big losses as well. We've seen really big losses in leisure and hospitality, which makes a lot of sense given the pandemic, but also in natural resources. So, our economy is changing. We're seeing some shifts in where our labor is focused. And because of that, it does impact, what policies you might want to be thinking about for your business and, for your industry. So with that in mind, let's advance to the next slide here. We're going to move into vaccinations and how that can be impacting your business right now. And then we'll go from there to talk about some of the other health concerns for this first part, like Ryan mentioned.
Thank you, Marie. It'll be interesting to see how those numbers evolve, whether they hold or whether we see sort of a return to where they were pre-pandemic. So as I mentioned before, Marie and I end up at SixFifty are helping hundreds of businesses with the return to work. And the number one question that we get is about vaccinations. Businesses across the country are struggling with how to adjust to the CDC's new guidance and to look at what they want to do in terms of vaccinations. So for those who are not aware, the CDC came out with new guidance on May 16th for people who are fully vaccinated. And the guidance caught some people by surprise. It said that fully vaccinated individuals may resume activities without wearing a mask or staying 6 feet apart. In other words, it kind of gave fully vaccinated individuals the guidance that they can return to doing the activities that they were doing in the past. There was a caveat, except where required by federal law, state law, and other workplace guidance. And so in a lot of states, and I would say California is the prime example, there's still very strict workplace guidance that has been put in place by Cal OSHA. But in Utah, that's not the case. And so that guidance has really opened the door for individuals and businesses to enter sort of a new chapter of this pandemic period. One thing that the CDC said that really struck me in its new guidance, and we'll send out these slides, and the latest guidance link is up there so you can visit this yourself. But the CDC said that we're still learning about how long people will be protected against COVID-19 from the vaccines and how effective they are against variants. And so I do think this is an evolving situation where we're going to see and learn a lot about vaccinations and whether we're going to need booster shots, how quickly we may need booster shots, and those kind of things. When we talk about businesses, let's look at the EEOC's guidance, which was just actually updated fairly recently, May 26, 2021. And the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which sort of sets and enforces employment law on a national level, has said that most businesses can require their employees to be vaccinated in order to enter the worksite. And so what that means is that businesses have essentially three options when it comes to vaccination policies. They can require their employees to be vaccinated in order to enter their worksite. They can encourage their employees to be vaccinated. And this takes two forms. Some businesses are providing incentives, some are not, or they can choose not to adopt a vaccination policy. We've talked to some business leaders who kind of wish that the government would have just forced them to choose one of these options, because they're difficult and they need to be tailored to individual businesses. I will say that as we've been helping businesses and doing presentations, the vast majority of the businesses that we've talked to are taking the middle route, and they're encouraging vaccinations, either with or without incentives. And you can look, there are several interesting examples of incentives. I know Publix grocery store is offering a $125 Publix gift certificate to their employees who are vaccinated, and other places are offering other types of incentives to try to help their employees be vaccinated. I actually live in Maryland, where our state has a lottery where they're just taking your vaccination number and drawing it out of a hat, and they're giving away millions of dollars to people who have been vaccinated to try to incentivize vaccinations, which has been interesting. The big question for many businesses, though, is whether to collect vaccination information about their employees. And this is especially for businesses that have decided to encourage vaccinations. If you're mandating vaccinations, you probably have to collect vaccination information. But interestingly, Santa Clara County in California put out rules that require businesses in Santa Clara to collect vaccination information about their employees. And they have to follow up at least every 2 weeks for employees who aren't vaccinated to see what their status is. And I think that's an interesting trend. I'm not sure if we'll see other jurisdictions follow that same path. But I think it goes to the fact that businesses are trying to figure out, do they need employee vaccination information in order to implement the CDC's guidance? How can they know who needs to social distance, who needs to mask, if they don't know the vaccination status of their employees? And so I think there are a lot of businesses that are collecting vaccination information, and we're seeing it done in two ways. Some businesses are collecting it through an anonymous survey, where they're able to collect information that helps them to do a risk analysis about their workforce, so they can see what percentage of their workforce is vaccinated, maybe even what sectors, break it down by sectors and look at percentages when they're thinking about how to bring people back and how they can put protections in place. And many other businesses are just straight collecting vaccination information from their employees, and they're anonymizing that data for use with their executive teams, but they're keeping track of who's vaccinated so that they can make important decisions about how to protect their workforce. Before we move on, I'll just say that for a long time as an attorney, I counseled my clients never to collect health information from their employees. That was sort of a gold standard. Never get health information from your employees, because it needs to be kept confidential and it cannot be stored in their personnel file. And so there's some added burdens on employers who are collecting this type of vaccination information. And that's something that you definitely want to keep in mind. And so as companies are thinking about vaccinations and vaccines, they need to be mindful of the advantages of collecting that information and the burdens that come with it. And, one of the reasons to collect that information is to understand what you need to do as far as masking and having your employees wear masks. And I know Marie has more to tell us about masking, especially in Utah.
Yeah, and I'll agree with what Ryan just said. As our company's chief privacy officer, as well as general counsel, before the pandemic, never, ever would have myself collected employee health data or encouraged any of my clients to do that. So it is definitely a very different situation that we're in now than we've been in the past. And like Ryan said, the main reason right now that employers are considering collecting vaccination information is because they have to make their own decisions about what rules to put in place because government mandates have been lifted in the state of Utah in particular. So I just did want to give a brief overview because I know a lot of the businesses here, like it's Salt Lake Chamber, but they actually support chambers throughout Utah. So I know there's some businesses on today that are in other parts of the state. And right now, the state of the state is that we no longer have a statewide mask mandate. However, if you are operating on tribal lands, the Navajo Nation in particular, which is the largest reservation that is part of Utah, they do still have mask mandates in place. So if you're operating there or you are sending employees there to carry out business operations, you need to be aware of that. And they haven't indicated when they'll be lifting that mandate. Utah did lift its statewide mask mandate on April 10th, as was required by the legislature because of meeting certain, guidelines that had been set out. But do keep in mind that we do still have really different transmission levels in different parts of the state. This is a quick, just a look at it visually that we pulled yesterday. So it's pretty up to date. You'll notice that the only part of the state currently that still is in a high transmission level is Grand County, which is home to Arches and Canyonlands National Park. So while the statewide mandate has been lifted, Grand County does still have some rules in place. For example, if you're going into any county buildings, you have to wear a mask. So you do still need to be aware, based on where you are, what local guidance might be, there may still be some masking rules in place that you do need to be aware of because of the situation on the ground where you're at. However, the state of Utah itself has put into place a rule that you cannot, going back to like masks as related to vaccines, if you're a state agency or if you're funded by the state, you cannot have a benefit that is reliant upon somebody's vaccination status. So if you're saying like you can't enter our premises unless you're vaccinated, that's not going to work if you're a state agency or funded by the state. So if you want to say like you need to be vaccinated or masked, that would be, the sort of middle ground that you could navigate there, but you can't mandate a vaccination for any benefits of the state right now. So with that, Utah has also given us some updated options from our coronavirus task force. If you go to coronavirus.utah.gov. So if you want to pull some for your premises to show the updated changes, if you're still trying to follow the CDC guidance, keeping people masked if they're not vaccinated, or you do have the option as a business to require masks, even though it's not required by the state, you do still have that option on your premises. And that's something that you need to decide based on your own risk analysis. How many people are coming in and out of your site? What level of contact are they having with one another? What are they engaging in risky behaviors because of the nature of your business? So, we saw at the beginning of the pandemic that, certain types of businesses, like for example, a bar, are more likely to be sites of transmission than other places where people have less contact with one another. So, you have to take into account the really specific risk factors that your business might face when you decide, if we're going to have a mask policy in place, what will that policy be? And with that, we did want to give you some more information on the current CDC guidance, the most up-to-date guidance. The first part of that being it is still recommended that people wear masks if they're unvaccinated or partially vaccinated. So keeping in mind the guidance on what is full vaccination currently means that 14 days have passed since your last vaccination shot. Last meaning your second one if you're in a 2-shot vaccination, or your first one if you got the 1-shot Johnson & Johnson vaccination. So partially vaccinated and unvaccinated people do still need to continue wearing masks and following social distancing protocols according to the CDC. And as Ryan mentioned, if you're fully vaccinated, you're now only told that you need to wear a mask where it's mandated by law or by the premises that you're currently at. And there's some places where they just still recommend that everybody wear masks. That would be correctional facilities, homeless shelters, public transportation, and transportation hubs. So that's why, if you're getting on a plane for some really fun summer travel, now that people are starting to travel more, You still have to wear your mask in the airport, whether or not you're vaccinated. You still have to wear it on the plane, whether or not you're vaccinated. So that guidance is, not mandatory at this stage, but it is something that, as you determine, what creates a safe workplace, because under OSHA, you do still have the requirement to provide a safe workplace. So how do you take that CDC guidance and turn it into a safe workplace for your employees and your customers? So that, again, like, it's a little bit harder in some ways because you're now being required to make that decision on your own, as opposed to being told by the state or federal government, this is what you have to do. We did throw in a couple of slides just for your information, because we're going to send this out afterwards, showing the different guidance right now from the CDC. A little green indicator on here means no prevention measures are needed, not just masks. Yellow and red, it's either, wear a mask and stay 6 feet apart, or like maybe really consider not engaging in that activity at all. And that's, for unvaccinated individuals. So that's just for your information, so that you can keep that in mind as you make your decisions about what rules you're going to put in place at your premises. And that takes us into, along with masking, we also still have physical distancing to think about. So again, this isn't mandated at this stage in the state of Utah, but you do still have to provide a safe environment if you're bringing your employees and customers back into your work sites. So with that, I did want to spend just a minute explaining what the CDC Hierarchy of Controls is. So Utah's done a really great job. They've put together what's called the COVID-19 Business Manual, and we have links to it in our slide deck that you'll be getting that will circulate today. And that business manual does rely on the CDC Hierarchy of Controls. And that's comes out from the CDC and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. And essentially what they've done is they set up this like inverted triangle of, what's the most effective way to protect people down to the least effective way. It's really interesting. We spent so much of the year focusing on PPE, personal protective equipment. And you'll notice it's the least effective way of preventing transmission. The most effective thing, obviously, is to eliminate the hazard. But obviously the things at the top of this pyramid, while most effective, tend to be the most expensive or hardest to implement. So COVID is here. We're not physically removing COVID yet. And maybe someday we'll have the science for that. But you work your way down and decide which of these controls are you going to implement. And so, you can engineer, you can create, solutions to avoid the hazard, to mitigate the hazard, administrative changes to the way that people work, and then PPE. So most of what you're looking at with, physical distancing as an example is engineering controls and administrative controls. In your space, can you isolate people? Fewer interactions between people means fewer transmissions. So, have you moved desks further apart from each other? Have you taken, work sites that were sort of maybe in, bunched in hubs and said, we have some empty conference rooms that we're going to turn into offices so that people can be isolated. So, have you done something like that with the physical distancing, or put in place administrative rules saying, we can't have more than this number of people in this space at this time. So although you're not mandated to do these by state or local guidance at this stage right now in Utah, it's still part of the approach that the CDC recommends. And so as you're trying to keep your employees safe and follow the OSHA guidelines to keep them safe, you need to think about, what can I do that would be effective, that would protect my workforce, that works for us, that still allows us to get work done and, do that risk analysis. So that's sort of the analysis that we want you to have in mind for any of these policies that you're putting into place. And we're going to talk also about, screening and other administrative controls that you could put into place to help mitigate these risks.
Yeah, for us at SixFifty, employee screening has just become a regular part of our workday. We have an employee screening tool that we provide to businesses that is simply a link that's sent out. And so we have that in our Slack channel, and every employee that comes into the business needs to fill out their employee screener. And it's interesting, now that employee screening isn't required, a lot of businesses are still thinking about keeping it in place. And in fact, Marie mentioned the Utah COVID-19 Business Manual, which is really an amazing resource put together by the state. And in that manual, they recommend that employers screen both employees and customers for signs of COVID-19 before they enter the workplace. That's really optimal for preventing the spread of COVID-19. And so it'll be interesting to see as we move forward how many businesses decide to stick with employee health screeners. There are some good reasons to think about that. One is that many workplaces will have individuals who can't receive the vaccine, either for medical or religious reasons. The other thing that we're seeing is that vaccinated individuals can still get COVID-19. I think your chances of getting it are reduced significantly, and the severity of it, if you do get it, is significantly reduced. But vaccinated individuals can get COVID-19, and so there's some real value to making sure that you keep sick individuals from entering your workplace. Another thing that we've heard from multiple employers is that they have been grateful for the health screener because it has kept sick individuals, and I'm talking about individuals who have sicknesses other than COVID-19, like colds or the flu or pneumonia, walking pneumonia, from coming into the office. And I think there's some real benefits actually to businesses to having employees fill out that health screener and reminding them that if they're sick, they should not come to the office. And I know many of us, myself included, have probably been guilty of coming into the office while sick because we had something important that we thought we needed to do, or there was some sort of responsibility that we had. And I think the health screener really takes that out of the employee's hands in a way that many businesses have found helpful.
Yeah, I don't think you're alone in that, Ryan. I have a sister who's a teacher, and she never stays home when she's sick if she can help it, because she has to keep her sick days for when her kids are sick. So, there's all kinds of things that, cause us to make these decisions that honestly are not necessarily the safest decisions for the people that we work with. So, that's definitely something to keep in mind. We wanted to make a quick push for continuing those cleaning and sanitation efforts that, you probably put into place at the beginning of the pandemic. But if you left your office and went remote and now are going back, you might not have put these into place. Think through the cleaning and sanitation process. There's some approved chemicals, we've hyperlinked that for you, that are best at, mitigating the risk from for transmission of COVID specifically. But also think about ventilation. If you're going back into an office space you haven't been using, have you put in a new HEPA filter? Have you done what you can to make sure that you're getting air that's circulating? Most offices are in places where you can't open the windows. And we've seen guidance that says, open windows and doors help reduce the risk of transmission. But, a lot of our office towers, you can't do that for other safety reasons. So what can you do to increase ventilation? And, make your plan, create a schedule for your cleaning and train your employees on what they need to do. Because part of it, honestly, is now I have, wipe down wipes and sanitation cleaning materials, space put next to the refrigerator in the break room. You put them in your high touch areas with signage reminding people what they need to do, because part of it is them helping become responsible and take on some of that work. And I'll just say, with all of this, deciding what is best and safest, Ryan's talking about screeners, I was talking about masking. Collecting health information through a screener, vaccination information through a screener can help you make decisions about, can we let everybody go without a mask? Or do we need to have a rule in place that only people that have told us they're vaccinated can go without a mask? Do we need to keep everybody out of the conference room? Or can we, say, if you're in the conference room, we want you to put on a mask because we know that we have some unvaccinated employees. So making decisions about what guidance you're going to implement, what rules you're going to follow in your work site will require you to get some of this information to help make your workplace a safe place. So that's really the takeaway on the COVID-19 specific policies, that it's really important for your companies to adopt right now. I did note, we noted earlier we'll have the CLE code. We failed to put it into the slide deck, so we'll send it out afterwards. But it will be made available. And what we're going to do now, though, is we're going to transition and talk about some of the other policies that aren't as related to the pandemic, but they've become more important because of the pandemic. So it's sort of, the new state of work as we're coming out of, hopefully, the pandemic, and as we're evaluating policies we may have had in place for a long time and not changed, or that policies we may never have created that we now recognize your workplaces need.
Thank you, Marie. I thought it would be nice to start with the video conferencing policy, since all of you are joining us through video conferencing platforms. And this is one that's interesting because I think a lot of businesses, and we're in this same situation, sort of we're forced to very quickly move from in-person meetings to virtual meetings, and ways to meet virtually and to hold all sorts of meetings, from interviews to performance evaluations, all these types of meetings on video conferencing platforms. And I think a lot of businesses sort of were forced into that and didn't think about what the implications of that are. And as we've been working with businesses on helping them to get back to work, many have reached out to us and said, what we really need are the policies that we need moving forward. And so what we did as a company is we created an employee handbook engine that can help companies to create a new employee handbook for this period of time where we have a more remote and diverse workforce. And this was one of the first policies that we added to that handbook, was a video conferencing policy, because most companies didn't have one already. And so it's important for companies to think about which platforms they support. Are you allowing people to video chat on or video conference on Zoom, or are you using WebEx or Google Meet, or there's a host of different platforms, Microsoft Teams, and a lot of companies only support a handful of those platforms, and it's something to think through for security reasons. Another big one is background filters. I'm sure most of you have that colleague who maybe has creative background filters. We have in our office, many of our engineers like to put themselves in famous Star Wars ships. They get on the morning meeting and they're sitting in the Millennium Falcon or something like that. But it's important to have in place a policy for what's appropriate in what settings, right? That may be fine kind of in our morning meeting talk around the cooler, but that may not be the way you want your employees representing your company in an important call with a customer or a client. And so thinking about background filters. Another one, and this may be surprising to some people, is dress codes. Now that people are working from home and video conferencing, we have heard of more and more incidents where people are not dressed appropriately for work. And that's an issue that can be easily addressed in a video conferencing policy so that you don't have to confront that issue as a business. Another is etiquette. There are certain things that you can do on a video call and other things that you shouldn't. Are you going to have people eating during your video calls, snacking on things, or drinking? Maria and I are both big on hydration, but there are a lot of different things that people would do on a video call that may not reflect well on your business and that you may want to put in an etiquette section. One that we touched on at the very beginning of this webinar when you joined is recording. There are privacy rights that are associated with recording virtual video conferences, and you need to understand those and have a policy in place. Another one that's important is confidential information. If you have individuals who are working at home and on video conferences where other people can overhear them, if they're sitting in the lobby of a Starbucks talking about confidential business information, you may run into a problem. And even at home, there may be confidential business information that you want to keep confidential. And so that can be an important part of a video conferencing policy. And then finally, if your business is, for example, creating Zoom accounts for people or the like, can they use those for their personal use? Is that something that is a problem for your business? And so these are just kind of, I would say, examples of the types of issues that businesses are now confronting because so much of the business that they do is through video conferencing, and why a video conferencing policy really is crucial for most businesses moving forward.
Yeah, I'll just say, especially because we have a really big increase in remote and telework. Some of that was in response to the pandemic and people will be going back to their offices, but some of it's going to be permanent. We have a lot of big tech companies, Facebook, for example, that have announced they're staying remote. We have others that have announced hybrid approaches. Apple said they're going to be doing a hybrid version. Their employees were upset they wanted the Facebook version. But we're seeing a lot more of that, and it's something that is going to continue. And I'm going to show you a couple of slides that will show you some of those trends in Utah. But teleworking as a response to future disasters. We may have another pandemic or other reasons people can't report into the office. Teleworking as an accommodation. In the past, if you had an employee who asked to work from home as an accommodation, you had a lot more leeway to say no. But coming out of this pandemic, if somebody needs that as an accommodation, it's much more likely that you're going to have to analyze the facts and likely come to the conclusion that that's an accommodation you could support for a lot of jobs, whereas before you may have thought you couldn't. But if that's a job that's been done, successfully in a remote situation for the last year, and you have somebody ask for an accommodation to do that same job from home in the future, it's likely you're going to see an increase in that as an accommodation. And then just, as a standard operating procedure, we're seeing companies that are realizing they can decrease their footprint. They can lower their facilities costs and other things. So there's sort of this new state of business that may help your business in a lot of ways. We share an office tower with a company that, reduced, they didn't reduce their workforce, they sent them home, and they got rid of a floor, right? That's an entire floor that they no longer have to rent. They no longer have to pay for utilities, all of those things. So they were able to reduce some costs. So teleworking is just going to increase. And in Utah, it has increased. We're going to show you a couple of slides now with a little bit of that information. One thing that I think is interesting is that you can see differences in telework across age and gender. Some of that's reflective of the type of work that people in Utah have, also dispersed by age and gender, which I'll show you in just a second. You can see telework was at its height when we first went into lockdown at the beginning of the pandemic. It decreased when we thought we were going to open up before the holidays. Then it increased again when we had that increase in the number of cases during and following the holidays. So it's just sort of this trajectory that we're on, but it's still a lot higher than it was pre-pandemic. So if we can go to the next slide here. So here's Utah. The national trend is the trend in blue. The Utah trend is the trend in orange. And you can see, we're below the national trend, but a lot of that is reflected by industry. So I noted earlier in the presentation that we've seen a big increase in construction, for example, in terms of employment in Utah. Construction is not a job you can do remotely. So some of that is based on industry. Some of it is based on, the types of jobs, but it's still above 20% in Utah, which is so much higher than it was in the past. And what this doesn't take into account specifically is hybrid working. The way the survey was done, that wasn't called out as a difference. So we may have some people that are doing some telework and some in-office work that aren't accounted for in this survey. Okay, let's go to the last one that I've got here, where I did mention the industry differences. So you can see, educational services are outstripping everybody on the national scale for who's teleworking, or they were, but now it's coming back down. So blue, not green. Blue shows, early pandemic, and orange shows current levels of telework. So you can see, some industries just lend themselves more easily, professional and technical services, for example, to telework. So, based on what industry you're in, that will also have a big impact on whether these are policies that you need to think about adopting in the future. And having a telework policy really can make a big difference to your organization. If we want to go to the next slide. And something to keep in mind is it's not just developing a policy that says, people in these categories of jobs can telework, or they can telework this many days a week, or that sort of thing. It's also a question of responsibility. If you do have a teleworking policy, you're still governed by OSHA, which requires you to provide a safe workspace, even for remote employees, which is interesting. The guidance that we have here is that essentially what you need to do is, if you're aware of existing hazards, you need to take care of them. So for example, you give your employee the setup for their home office. So it's okay, we're going to give you a desk, we're going to give you a computer, but you're going to set it up at home. That business that I talked about that had remote employees, they sent people home, but they did not send them home with their standing desks, because the standing desks they had in their office were a tip hazard. They had to be installed properly by a professional. So they're we're not sending our employees home with these standing desks. They might install them wrong, tip hazard, and now we have, you know, an unemployment benefits issue that we may have to address. Or sorry, we have an accident that occurred in the workplace. So keep in mind, like, you do need to take steps to ensure that, you know, the workplace is safe if it's remote. These people are still covered by workers' compensation laws if they suffer an injury that arises, you know, incident to the work. So you need a policy that'll say, like, these are your work hours, these are your job duties, these are the guidelines for what you can do while you're working remotely. And you create a policy so that you can say, like, if somebody tripped going down the stairs while they were running to get to the door in time for the Home Depot delivery because they're doing a home project during lockdown, that's outside the realm of work, right? But if they were going down the stairs to get a delivery that you sent them for, you know, you're sending them documents, you're sending them something else related to work, that could actually be covered. So we have some case law in Utah. Back in 2000, there was somebody that was sprinkling salt on his driveway. He was a remote employee. And he went out to salt his driveway because he was about to receive a delivery from the office and his driveway was icy. Well, he slipped and suffered an injury, and that was actually covered by workers' compensation. So you might think, like, oh, salting his driveway, it's his driveway, we don't have to worry about it. Well, you might say, well, we need a policy that tells people not to do that, right? It's like, you know, that's not part of your job. We don't need you to do that. And so I mean, that's a really specific example, but policies that cover what is and isn't included in the work will become important if you have a remote workforce.
Yeah, that's an interesting example, Marie. And I would say, relatedly, with employees working at home, one thing that has been a national trend is employees who are not required to be in an office location are moving all over the country. And I put this top picture because we have heard, at least anecdotally, that people are especially leaving California and moving to the beautiful state of Utah, where the cost of living is better and the skiing is much better. But it's interesting, as we hear of people leaving, especially areas that are very expensive, like San Francisco or New York, and moving to other areas because they can work remotely. The problem with that situation is that it is important, I would say even critical, for businesses to know where their employees are working, because where employees are working can have significant tax and benefits implications. And so if you have an employee who works for you in Utah, and then during the pandemic, when you went remote, moved to Montana and is working from Montana, you actually, as a business, may now have obligations to register in the state of Montana, to pay Montana taxes, to offer the benefits that are required in Montana. And so those are the kind of things that a business needs to know up front. And many businesses didn't have that type of policy in place because their employees were coming into the office. It was easy to know if someone was working in Montana because everyone else was working in the office. And so, you know, those kind of things, I think that's a significant shift for businesses. And that's why a relocation, or sometimes it's called a temporary relocation policy, is important for businesses. Because even if someone is moving to another state for 6 months or 2 months, it's important for you as a business to know where your employees are working. And so I think the relocation policy is an interesting example of a policy that really was not needed by most businesses or by many businesses pre-pandemic, but it's really crucial post-pandemic, that employees, you know, I've heard anecdotally a number of stories of employees moving to less expensive areas and then not telling their employer. And then after 6 or 8 months, the employer discovers that the employee has moved, and then they have to sort of figure out what to do at that point. That's especially important if you have a business that has locality pay. I was formerly a federal government employee and was paid based on where I lived. And so, you know, in a situation where there's locality pay, if you're being paid at a San Francisco or a Washington, D.C. rate, and you've moved to Kansas, there could be a really important truing and difficult truing up to do at that point. And so a relocation policy is really one that I think all businesses should be thinking about, that allow for, I would say, telework, but especially extended periods of telework.
Yeah, and I'll just say, if you do have an employee request to move to Montana, as a Utah employer, you should say no, because Montana is not an at-will state. So that one should be on your no list. Nothing against Montana; it's also beautiful.
It is a beautiful state. That's why it was my example. It's a big change, actually. You know, it's a neighboring state, both in the West. But if you have an employee move from Utah to Montana, they may move from being an at-will employee to not being an at-will employee.
Which for you as a business is yes, a very big deal. Sort of related to that, and especially important because of telework and remote work, looking at whether you have an outside employment and work schedule policy. So, when everybody was coming into the office together, it was really easy to be like, okay, we're open these hours. This is when you have to be here. You'll take a lunch, and that's the schedule. But now people are at home, and they're, a lot of this year, they've also been like doing childcare duties and other things because schools were closed. And, it was a weird year. But, you need to think about, what is that work schedule? Partially because going back to what we were just talking about, it could impact whether an injury claim that happens in the home, if somebody's working at home, might fall under, workers' compensation or not fall under it. So is there a work schedule? But also for FLSA purposes, you have hourly and non-exempt salary employees that will need to be accurately reporting their time. So, work schedules, limitations of liability, and then outside employment. So you may say, like, these hours are mine. And in the past, it might have been easy to say, if you have outside employment outside of those hours, it doesn't impact me. But now, if you have this much more flexible approach, people are working remotely, and a lot of businesses are taking the approach of, we don't care when you work as long as you get the work done if you're a remote employee. Well, can they have outside employment? If they do you have a policy in place that tells them they can't use, your equipment for that outside employment? So I'm talking to you today from a SixFifty computer. And what if I wanted to use my SixFifty computer to do work for my other employer? Would that potentially have some security risks? Could there be other things associated that are problematic? So, whether you're telling people that they can or can't have outside employment, you have the legal right to do that with some limitations, but you can also, put some roadblocks around what they can and can't do. And I did just want to point out for Utah specifically, if you have an outside employment policy that says you can't have outside employment, you do have to make some exceptions. One of those is if somebody's acting as an emergency service provider. So say you have an employee who's also one of our first responders. So I have a friend who works with our mountain rescue team. It's actually a volunteer job, but he gets call outs. His employer can't say you're not allowed, to do that because it is a first responder position that has this carve out in Utah law. And also with your outside employment policy, you can't discourage legally protected activity. So just keep in mind, if your policy is somehow, particularly restrictive of, free speech or other activity that's legally protected, you'll need to revisit that policy. And that's, it's just sort of something that you should think about honestly with any policy you put into place. You want to be careful and make sure you're not accidentally, crossing over into a space where your policy might be discriminatory in some way or in some other way be legally problematic. And that's why, like Ryan mentioned, SixFifty's put so much time into creating the policies that we've created.
Yeah, Marie, it's interesting. When we came out with our employee handbook, which includes over 50 policies that can be catered to the law in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, we asked our customers to let us know what policies they were most interested in. And one that we have been asked to create multiple times is a hoteling policy. And I have to admit that when we first received these requests, I didn't know what a hoteling policy was. We don't focus on specific industries. And I thought, I don't think we want to make a policy specifically for hotels, but that's not what hoteling is. And it's interesting. And for those of you that, like me, don't know what hoteling is, hoteling is a practice where businesses are taking out individuals' offices and creating a hub of offices that can be used by anyone. And so everyone's taking their pictures of their family and all their awards home, and they're creating standard offices that can be reserved and used by individuals who come in. And there are a lot of reasons that businesses like to do this. For many businesses, it allows them to have a much smaller real estate footprint, because they've realized that only so many of their employees are coming in each day. And so if they have standard offices that those employees can use, they can have a lot less office space and save a lot of money on real estate. And so businesses that are doing this, sometimes you call it hot desking, I know, is where you have a desk and it's not yours and you just are able to use it, are trying to think hard about what needs to be in a hoteling policy. And we're actually in the process of creating a document generation engine that will generate a hoteling policy, and that'll be coming out here in July. But some of the things to think about include, how often are employees expected or allowed to come into the office? Is it a situation where everyone has an opportunity, or could someone sign up to hotel every single day? Or do you want them to hotel at least once a week or once every 2 weeks so that they have some connection to the office? How are they going to reserve a desk? You need to figure out, you don't want more people come in than you have desks. And so how are you going to handle that? And how can you lay that out in a policy that is clear for employees? Can they leave documents or other work products at the office? Which is an interesting one. I think some offices have created individual drawers in a filing cabinet that belong to different employees. And so they can put their stuff in a filing cabinet so they don't have to take it home, but it's not in a specific office. There are other creative ways that businesses are dealing with that. And then there's etiquette. Are you going to allow people to eat in the offices? I know I wouldn't want to come into a hoteling office and find an empty soda can and a muffin wrapper or something. I think you want to make sure that you're setting forth expectations for how people will use the offices. And I think that's closely related to sanitation and cleaning. I know for me in a hoteling situation, I'd want to know that the office I'm going into has been cleaned, that the keyboard's clean, the chair's clean, that the desk is clean. And so I think you want to make sure that you have not only a policy, but a process in place to do that if you're going to be hoteling as a business, and that you let your employees know what the expectation is for them and the expectations for you. And so I really think hoteling is something that we're going to see more and more of, that it's probably a trend that's not likely to go away in the near future as companies move to this new hybrid work site where they have people working in their office and people working at home, and they're trying to efficiently use the space that they have.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I've hoteled in the past where, I'm going to visit the parent company at a different office. And so I can reserve a desk because they kept some available for people like me who are in town for a day. But now in town for a day might become much more standard. And so you need to get rid of some of the personalized offices. I lost my personalized office at the beginning of the pandemic. I now have a filing cabinet that I and one other employee have the key to, because I have access to all the sensitive documents at our company, right? So, coming up with ways to adapt clean desk policies, like those are all so important from that perspective. And I think this is just sort of our main takeaway, honestly, is, what we've learned about employment policies and procedures this year is that we all need to be more nimble than we were in the past. We've got to establish strong leadership and decide what we want our culture to be. And then we have to proactively, put that out there for our employees. A lot of that's about communication. And so we were talking about policies today. You need these underlying policies to put in place. What is that culture going to be? But you also have to be really clear about communicating those to your employees so they understand the new expectations, what's changing as it's happening, and why. I think why has become a lot more important to employees. Employee health, stress, a lot of things that in the past we might have thought of as the province of big business. Like, you can have this really cool program if you're the Amazons of the world, right? Where you focus on some of those mental health issues and things, but we're small and we don't think about that as much. That's not really the case anymore. Everybody has seen how the pandemic has impacted their workforce on every level, the level of loss, the level of anxiety, the level of stress, and clear communication is a really big and important part of decreasing that stress and anxiety for your employees and your customers. so that they feel comfortable, they feel confident, and they feel dedicated to you and fulfilling what you ask them to do.
Yeah. Thanks, Marie. I think that was a really good summary. You know, if the pandemic has taught us anything, I think it's that we need to be prepared for anything as businesses, and that it's hard to predict what the future holds. And I think those are some really great tips for businesses as they're thinking about how they can fortify themselves for what comes next. It's really been great to present today. We appreciate it. And I'm going to turn the time back over to Josh. But before I do, I want to thank the Salt Lake Chamber for hosting us today, and Josh for his warm introduction. We obviously are a Utah business, and we love working with businesses in Utah, and we're grateful for the opportunity to present.
So I know we have about 4 or 5 minutes left. There are no questions in the Q&A. I've got just one quick one that I might like to ask. So work at Rio Tinto Kennecott, we have a lot of individuals who want to tour our facility. We have a visitor center, and we're looking at how and what we open up. We're getting a lot of requests for people to visit our site. Are we able, like right now we have a volunteer, I've been vaccinated, we can let the business know. Can we require, if we're going to take someone on a tour of our facilities, to have a vaccination card, or is that a step too far?
That is not a step too far. Legally, you can require that. I should caveat, I don't know if you're funded by the state. I don't think you are. So yeah, with that caveat, yeah, you absolutely can do that. As a business, you have that kind of control over your premises. And one thing I would recommend is, if you're asking for that from visitors, that you put a process in place where you find out what it is, they get their clearance to come, but then you get rid of the record. So put in some document retention policy. If you're taking pictures, it might just be that you're checking it and then you somehow indicate that they're cleared to come through, or whatever it is. But if you do take pictures or have them sign something, don't keep the record.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Marie makes a great point. Although Utah has rolled back its requirements, it still allows businesses to take steps to protect their employees. And I think that's a great example, right? You wouldn't be required to do that, but that may be something that you want to do as a business to protect those who are giving tours or others who may come into contact with people who are coming to visit your site.
And can I just say, my nephews love that tour. They're going to be really excited to hear it might be opening up again.
It is quite a sight. It's like dinosaurs for little kids seeing whole. Yeah. One other quick one, and then I'll wrap up. You discussed work hours and working from home, and part of this is the world that I live. As I'm looking at my calendar as I'm talking to you guys, the world of, you don't have to drive into the office, so that saves time. We set up meetings from beginning of work hours to after. And I've noticed, the start times and finish times have increased. What was, a 9-hour day with a lunch, or an 8-hour day without a lunch is now, 10, 11-hour days. That seems pretty consistent. Do businesses run into any risk or issue by broadening that kind of, seems like we're in more meetings, and maybe that's just me, but it seems to be a trend.
I think it's definitely a trend. I've seen that trend on my own calendar, and I know, Ryan, you've probably seen it too. That's something, the main thing you want to think about that with is employees who are hourly. Your salary exempt employees, it's not as much of a concern with, but you've got a lot of regulations around your hourly and your non-exempt employees that you need to be paying attention to, and that's where you might want to really put in some cutoffs with a policy. Ryan, other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I agree with you as far as the legal aspect. And Josh, I think there may also be sort of a cultural aspect that you're hitting on as well. And, a written policy that says we don't expect people to be available for example, teleconferencing meetings after a certain time may be a way, if you're thinking culturally, that you want to make sure that people are balancing, because I do think that's a struggle. With all the advantages of not having to commute to work, the disadvantage is that we can work all the time, and fighting that off can be hard. And I do think a policy document can sort of help set culture if that's also a concern, sort of beyond the legal concerns that Marie discussed.
All right, thank you guys. In interest of time, saw a lot in the chat. This information, thank you, 650, will be made available to all those. I believe it's on the website from me reading the chat. One kind of takeaway that I'm, Rio Tinto mining company, very focused on safety, history of mining, a lot of, pretty rough industry back in the day. I think we're now order of magnitude safer than if you were to work at the Gap. I mean, they're very focused, and we put in a lot of controls. Vaccinated, I still wear a mask, required to wear a mask at work. We've also done a few things with proximity devices, which is so if you get within 6 feet of me, it'll start beeping, and it's annoying enough that you separate. But it's been a pretty good tool as we're going back and we're dealing with the challenge of those who are vaccinated and those who are not. And I think there's a lot of good tech and a lot of solutions out there that can make it all work. It's just, I think it becomes a little more difficult as we work with, if you're a smaller company besides, an international like Rio Tinto, the chamber, the governor's office, there's a lot of good options and help out there. So for those who maybe are on the call who might be a smaller size company, don't despair and use those resources that are available. And thank you to all. We appreciate your time. And thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Marie. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Josh.
much. We'll see you tomorrow.
Take care.